I am Kathy Brett with Becker's Healthcare. The program will begin with the presentation, and we will have a question and answer session following completion of the presentation. You can submit any questions you have throughout the presentation by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Our presenter will attempt to answer as many questions as he can during the time we have, and will follow up on questions he does not have the opportunity to address. You will receive an email within about a week following the webinar that will include instructions for how you can download a copy of the presentation. You will also receive a follow-up email shortly after completion of the program. You can submit your feedback or any additional questions at that time. This email will not include the presentation. I would now like to introduce today's presenter. Chris Clausen is Vice President of Supply Chain for Surgical Care Affiliates in S4. Chris has more than 20 years of supply chain leadership experience in the healthcare, high-tech, and automotive industries. Prior to joining SCA, he served as a supply chain consultant and in senior leadership positions at Intel and Gateway Computers. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Chris to begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Kathy, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this webinar today. And the focus of the presentation today is what can you do on Monday to lower your supply costs? And we're going to focus mainly on case costing. Next slide. So first, we'll focus on fundamentals. So how do we define case costing and what is the impact? Next is the cataract case study. So we performed a case to what we'll into the step. Well,
Chris, let me interrupt.
Sure.
Chris, let me interrupt for just a second. If you're using a headset, I think it's breaking up. I'm not sure if that's the case. So you may want to switch over if you can so that all attendees can hear you.
Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. My apologies. Okay. Next slide. So what are the fundamentals of supply cost savings or control? First, we look at utilization, which is utilizing the right combination of products in our ORs. And also, of course, we focus on price and supplier contracting. The interrelationship between those two items is what helps us to drive our best cost per case and accelerate our cost savings. In this presentation, we're going to focus on the utilization of supplies. Next slide, please. In general, most facilities experience a high variance in the types of cases that they perform. And the dimensions that we look at are the case type, so what types of cases are we performing, the number of physicians that are performing that type of case, and then the payer relationships. In a typical case, we see about 2,000 potential combinations, which is a lot of variables to consider when you're trying to prioritize where to go after supply savings. Next slide. So one of the first things that we recommend is getting focused on the top high cost and high variable cases. So those cases highlighted in blue are, across our network anyway, the cases where we see the highest variability in cost and the highest cost per case. And you can see the procedures listed there. Those items in white below have high cost or low cost and low variance. So for those types of cases, we tend to focus more on things like contracting, contract compliance, and price improvement because we see less variability from one case to another. So as we attack case costing, those cases highlighted in blue are our area of focus, at least across the SCA network. Next slide, please. This slide highlights the impact of, in terms of profit per OR minute and the effect of optimizing case costing. So on the left, we have a typical lap band procedure, and we can see that the typical cost per case is about $29. And then if we optimize, profit per case is $29. If we optimize our cost, we can see that improve to as much as $43 per case, or 46% increase. We see the same thing on ACL repair. And on these two cases, on most of the analytics you're going to see today, we're focusing on the med-surg and pharma portion of the case cost. So the ability to control utilization on these cases of the right supplies based off of best-in-class sorts of analytics has a tremendous impact on the profitability at facilities. Next slide, please. Alternatively, when we're not optimized, we can see the same effect on profit per OR minute as well. So where we at the higher range of cost, we see a pretty big impact in profit per case as well. So shoulder arthroscopies on the left and cataracts on the right. And that's these are real examples across SCA of what we've seen when we're paying, when we're not optimizing, we're paying at the high range of the cost per case. Next slide, please. So we'll dive into a cataract case study. We chose cataracts because it's a common procedure. We perform 80,000 cataract procedures a year at SCA, and it's relatively easy to document the items that we're using and perform a simple comparison. So I thought this would be a good example to share with the group. Next slide. So this is the facility we chose, and basically this shows the cost per case that was experienced at the facility on their med-surg and pharma. So they were paying about $284 per case for those items that are in their pack, their pharmaceuticals, and the med-surg items that they buy outside of their surgical pack. We did an analysis at the facility and found that the lowest cost within the facility, the best performing physician, was at about $235 per case, and that resulted in about $100,000 worth of savings if we were to achieve best in class in the facility. When we benchmark that facility against the entire SCA network, which are in our benchmark there for cost per case per cataract is $166, we can see an opportunity of $236,000 for the savings. Since performing this case study, we've now adopted this methodology across about 15 of our largest eye facilities and are on track to save north of $1 million across SCA. Next slide, please. So identifying our supply requirements, there's really 6 basic categories for a cataract case, and I think we would find this if we analyzed other case types as well. So we wanted to bucket our supplies that we utilize into 3 real categories here. What are those items that have few options? We all know that there's only a few viscoelastic suppliers out there. VSS is only supplied by Alcon. So, those are areas where they're kind of a must-have for the case and likely not a big opportunity in terms of utilization for improvement. Then there's the category of many options. We use lots of different types of knives and blades, different anesthetic options, as well as drugs, and there's multiple types of drugs, and within each of those drugs we find variances between the various antibiotics physicians are using and other categories. And then we have to also consider our preference products. So these again are variable, and these are the areas that are going to require behavior in order to make a behavior change in order to realize savings. In the case of cataracts, we found that to be antibiotics, the dilation accelerators, the miotics, and then there's some other categories as well. Some knives and blades may fall into this preference category as well. Next slide, please. So each one of these bars on the facility here, on this page here, represents a surgeon. And what we tried to segment the products in terms of are what is inside their pack. So that's their pick pack plus whatever items that the facility has chosen to include in the pack, those items that are purchased outside the pack, and then pharmaceuticals. And we can begin to see the differences from one facility or from one surgeon to another in terms of cost per case. And the surgeon in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 bar over is one of our outliers, and we want to go take a look at his cost. And then there's some other opportunities as well. And we can also see on this graph who our lowest cost surgeons are, and we can start to identify our best in class. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's critical is to deep dive into your surgical packs. And in the case of cataracts, these are the pick packs. And we can see that when we look at the surgeons on the left, there's a pretty big variance in terms of the various items that they're using and what they're paying for those different items. There's probably multiple suppliers in this case, and maybe we're using multiple blades. Those sorts of things can affect the cost per case. So it's a simple way to basically document what are those key things that are highly variable and that can affect the cost per case where we want to attempt to reduce those costs. Next page, please. And this is an example of items that we found outside the pack. And each shade of blue on those bars represents a different category of supply. So, blades has a pretty big effect here. The use of pencils, cannulas, those sorts of things can affect the cost per case. And then you can see irrigation, med-surg. All those kinds of things can affect the cost per case. And this, again, helps us to basically get into the case that's performed and start to determine where we can find savings. Next slide, please. Sorry, I don't know if I'm experiencing a delay, but my slide hasn't advanced. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. And here's what we see is variability across pharmaceuticals as well, and the dollars on the left are far lower scale than what we were looking at on the previous slide. So we tend to think, in this case, that pharmaceuticals are less varied, and there's still opportunities as we look at these different drugs. We can see a lot of changes in the antibiotic, as an example. If you look at the kind of medium shaded blue bar on here, we can see there's a big variance from one surgeon to another in the cost of the antibiotic that they're using. So that's a potential area for improvement. Next slide, please. And this is just a summary of our savings for the facility. By using best-in-class analytics, we're able to determine that there was about a $200,000 savings on supplies. Also, in almost every case, in cataract cases anyway, there's an opportunity to optimize a rebate. So the combination of various supplies that are purchased can result in optimizing the rebate to the facility or not optimizing it. In this case, we also recommended some market share conversion from one supplier to another to optimize the rebate. So the total savings for the facility became $300,000, which really got the physician's attention. Next slide, please. So the next part of this presentation, we're really going to dig into, what are the steps that we follow to produce the analytics I just showed you in that case study. And we tried to break this out simply to say, okay, if you broke this out on that, what activities we could do each day per week, just to show that, it's a fairly, it can be a daunting task or intimidating to go perform this kind of analytic. And if you break it down, if you focus on, your top priority cases, and then you break those cases down into steps in terms of how to achieve the analytic, it actually becomes a little bit easier to accomplish. Next slide, please. So how do we analyze a case? A key step in the analysis process is to perform a kickoff with your team. So engaging the clinicians in your facility, perhaps your purchaser, is very important. Even more important in our experience has been identifying a physician champion. This helps to lend credibility to the activity that we intend to perform in the facility. And in our experience, if we're going to ask surgeons to change behavior, the best way to accomplish that is through peer-to-peer discussions. So, most of us are not experts on these items that are used within the cases, and the surgeons are the ones that have that level of expertise and are most effective at communicating this type of change. We then want to perform our case data analytic. So pulling our preference cards or our supplies used information, this is often one of the trickier steps in the process, but one that is very necessary is to determine the actual items we're using in the case. And we want to also pull our purchase history. So looking at the supplies we've purchased over, maybe the last 6 months period of time, and comparing that against our preference cards to make sure that our pricing is accurate. And then next we want to validate our data. So it's very, very important when we're engaging surgeons and our staff in terms of identifying these opportunities that everyone agrees that the data is credible. So the best way to accomplish that, in our experience, has been to reach out to those folks that are in the OR performing these cases and verify that the items we think they're using in a case are what they're actually using. Another step here is to actually go into the OR and observe these cases, which we've done frequently as well. And then we want to perform an opportunity analysis. So now we've gathered our data, we validated it, and now we want to put it into a simple matrix for everyone to review so that we can start to identify what is best in class and what are those things that are needed to change in order to achieve that best in class. And finally, engage our surgeons. So we want to show them the impact of this analytic and what it means to them financially. And then we want to clearly lay out what our next steps are and start laying out expectations to pull through our savings opportunity. Next slide, please. So let's start off on Monday. So we're going to go ahead and kick off our case analysis. So first and most important is to identify the CPT and just pick one that we want to go off and analyze. Oftentimes we'll look at CPT combinations as well. So as we attempted to perform best-in-class analytics around GI cases, as an example, it was very important for us to break out those colonoscopies that we performed versus the colonoscopy plus biopsy or lesion removal, because there's a dramatic difference in the case costing of those two types of cases. So we recommend choosing a CPT, and where relevant, choosing a CPT combination to review. And really, focus on your high volume cases, and as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, those cases that have high cost and high variability are going to be those that are going to be most impactful to your facility. A word of, just a note here is oftentimes also they're the most complex and most kind of difficult to do this kind of analyses on. That's why we want to make sure we're breaking this down into easily digestible steps. Let's review our annual case volume by physician, and then identify our physician champion. This doesn't have to be the physician that performs the most cases, or, I think what we're looking for here in our physician champion is the person that can best affect our outcome, the person that can influence other physicians to make this change. And then we want to engage with our key staff. We want to make sure that everyone is aligned, that there's a clear timeline as to when we're going to start and stop this activity, and maybe we want to create an incentive. We've seen terrific success where we have a big party for the staff at the end of the event, or even financial incentives, I think, here are very appropriate. Next slide, please. Tuesday. So this is where the hard work begins. So this is where we're going to pull our preference cards. Sometimes we have to create them. Oftentimes we have to update them. And I'll show kind of what we see in a typical example in a minute, and how we document those preference cards for comparison. We want to document our pack contents. Nearly every pack we buy will have a bill of materials as a part of it. So within especially in the case of iPacks, Alcon usually and others usually do a great job of documenting those items that are in the pack. And we want to write those items down separately on our prep cards so we know what's included. We want to take a look at we want to start categorizing these items. So, what's in our med surge? Typically blades, cannulas, needles, some of those other things we talked about. Let's document each item of pharmaceutical that we're buying and the dosages that we're using those in. And then if it's important, we can analyze the IOL cost. In our experience in cataract cases, we find that IOLs are very, very consistently priced. So it wasn't of value to include those in the analytic. We want to review the quantities of each of those items that we're using. So pay attention especially to multi-dose pharmaceuticals. That was a real challenge for us when we first performed this. And then let's document our rebate tiers. So pull out your contract from your cataract provider and look at those tiers. What is necessary to accomplish the percentage rebates that we can achieve. And then as we're doing this, let's also pull our purchase history. It's necessary to check what's on your prep card versus your purchase history to make sure that the pricing is accurate, our units of measure are aligned, those sorts of steps. Next slide, please. So on the left is an actual prep card from one of the facilities we analyzed. And it tells us the fundamental items that we need to pull for our surgeon. I think it's certainly this type of document is completely adequate in terms of making sure that we are pulling the right supplies to perform our case. But what we really want to do is create the example on the right, which is a very simple Excel spreadsheet that we put together that simply takes that data from our preference card, lists out all the items that were included in it, to include the part number wherever it's available in the preference card, and we'll have to fill that in later if it's not there. And then we can compare that against our purchase history to make sure we have all the right pricing. We just don't have pricing in here because we keep that as confidential information, but of course that's all part of the pref card that we create. And we do this for each preference card that we intend to analyze. Next slide, please. This is a quick graph that just shows some of our findings as we aggregated our preference cards. So we started to see trends around, in this case, our antibiotic costs. So on the left are basically those brand labeled antibiotics that are used in our facilities, and then as we get off to the right, we can see the generics. And this had a pretty big effect on our cost per case and became an immediate area of focus as we began to analyze preference cards. Next slide, please. So then this is the validation step. So we've now taken our pref cards, we've created this simple Excel spreadsheet that documents what each surgeon's using, and now we want to take that and review it with the staff, making sure that those items that we have on there are all correct, that we're not missing anything. Perhaps we want to look at this over maybe a day or two to make sure that we've gathered all the correct information. If there's any questions or gaps, we want to document those. And again, I mentioned observing cases. So it's important that the purpose for observing the case is really to see, are we using all these items, and just double check our preference cards. And then finalize our supplies used list. So this becomes then the final pref card that we're going to use to perform our best-in-class analytic. Next slide, please. Now on Thursday, we can do our opportunity analysis. So now that we know what's on our pref card, we can total those items. We can categorize them in the way we described earlier. So what's within the pack, what's outside the pack, what are our pharmaceuticals, what are those things that are blades, or however we choose to categorize those things, so we can start to look at the trends from one surgeon to another. So that's an important step there. Then we can start to review our variances. As we saw on the graphs at the beginning of the presentation, we can start to see the trends from one surgeon to another. Where is our low-cost surgeon and where's our high-cost surgeon? It's probably appropriate to have a conversation to make sure that, that those physicians are performing identical cases, which is always true in cataracts, but it might not be a bad idea to have a conversation there. And then calculate our opportunity. So we simply take, our average cost per case that we see here versus our best-in-class cost per case and multiply that times the number of cases that we perform each year. And then we want to do our rebate calculation, identify any low-hanging fruit. We just looked at the pharmaceutical example a minute ago. Obviously, there's no reason to wait. We see an opportunity in antibiotics. Let's go start talking to folks about that. High-cost blades is an opportunity. In the analyses we performed, we found that there was substantial savings associated with moving from disposable blades to reusable blades, as an example. And we saw high variance in the blades that were used. We happen to identify in some of these cases that our packs were overpriced. So we can start to look at the items that we're using in them, and oftentimes we knew what the price of those individual items were, and then we could start to see opportunities to reduce that cost in packs. We also identified reprocessing opportunities. So the ability to reprocess phaco tips, blades, other items like that is often an opportunity. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's kind of what our opportunity analysis looks like. So we've categorized our items. We have the doctors listed in the columns off to the right, and we can start to see where our best-in-class opportunities were. And then we can calculate our savings by surgeon, right? So we know the volumes that they're performing. We know what their total cost per case is. We know then what their total spend is, and we can compare that against best-in-class. It's a pretty simple spreadsheet to put together in order to analyze this. And the result is this is our savings. It's rare that we're going to pull through all the savings in this type of analytic. In fact, when we model this at FCA, we typically model about 50% in terms of the savings we'll achieve. We're not going to ask people to dramatically change their behavior in the OR. We want to do what makes sense, and I think we have to be open to compromise here. The other thing I'd say is as we completed that case study in Florida, we then proceeded with a larger study across 5 facilities, identifying in the order of $450,000 worth of savings across those 5. And with full participation of surgeons, we actually pulled through 70% of that opportunity. So while these conversations aren't always easy, the results are usually outstanding. Next slide, please. Okay, surgeon engagements. So we've identified our surgeon champion, and we want to talk to our surgeon partners. We found that the best way to do that is often to tailor our audience, meet with the surgeons individually, and then follow up with a group meeting with the surgeons. That way everyone's very prepared. They're not surprised by the data when we're putting in front of them. Sometimes we blind the data, and sometimes we put the names in the data. That's really the administrator's call as to how best to do that. And we also recommend doing this off-site, right? So have folks step outside the facility, less distractions, and a comfortable atmosphere to have this kind of conversation. And then we want to document our next steps and create our actionable plans. Next slide, please. Now we want to manage our pull-through. So communicate our action plan. So we've all agreed that we're going to make these changes. We may need to go back and negotiate with our suppliers around perhaps our packs or what's included in our packs. We may have found there's opportunities for savings by comparing the various items that we're using in terms of the price of those items. We probably need to perform some product evaluations. So if we're asking people to change blades, we're asking people to try different antibiotics, let's set up a formal evaluation and let's document the results of those evaluations to review with the team later. Let's finalize our changes and then calculate our impact. As I mentioned a minute ago, it's unlikely we're going to achieve 100%. So how much can we achieve now that we've had this discussion? Communicate our savings, and let's monitor our purchases. So routinely from that point on, let's double check what we're buying, let's double check what's in our packs, and let's double check our prep cards against what we intended to perform here. And then let's celebrate our success. One other thing I'd recommend here is reaching out to like facilities. So you might have other administrators in your network that perform these types of cases, and these can then become new benchmarks for your facility in terms of how to lower costs. So I might recommend that you reach out to those folks and establish a benchmarking council and then better improve your best-in-class analytic over time. Next slide, please. Wow, I went through that material fast. I apologize. Do we want to open it up for questions?
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for a great presentation. We're now going to begin the Q&A portion of the program. As a reminder, you can submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labels, enter a question for staff, and clicking send. And Chris will attempt to answer as many questions as he can during the time that we have for questions, and we'll follow up on any he doesn't have the opportunity to address. While we're letting Chris review some of the questions that come in, I do have a few here that we have. The first one is, in what specialties have you experienced the most success?
We showed cataracts as a great example of where we've identified where we've seen a lot of success. Other areas include ENT and shoulder arthroscopies. So those are areas where we also saw similar high variance and a lot of opportunity to engage. So across those few procedures on the order of 11 or 12 facilities, we pulled through about $1.5 million in savings.
Okay, well, thank you. And how often should we reevaluate the results?
I think at least annually is a good idea to reevaluate results. It's just a good practice to begin to review your case costs at least every 12 months, sometimes even 6 months. But I think it's just a matter of what is the workload versus the return in your facility. So I would recommend 6 to 12 months.
Great, thanks. Another question we have here is, how do you get doctors engaged?
The best way to get doctors engaged is to identify the surgeon champion and then begin to initiate those peer-to-peer conversations. And, I think also, oftentimes, in my experience, we're a little intimidated to talk to the surgeons and ask them to make changes. So that's sometimes an uncomfortable place to be. At the same time, once we have those conversations, the physicians, in our opinion, have been very, very thankful to see the data and really welcome the opportunity to reduce costs. So, identifying a champion and going to them with actual data that demonstrates to them the savings opportunities is very effective.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We do have many questions coming in from attendees. While Chris reviews them, I want to draw your attention to the last screen that you see up here, and this is how you may contact Chris. His telephone number is 949-292-7722 or chris.clausen@scasurgery.com. We have another question here. What is the best way to negotiate PAC costs? How do we get a full list of suppliers?
So typically the list of supplies is on the PAC itself. So you'll see those items listed there. And if not, you can certainly request those from your local rep, and they can provide you with the list of all those items that are in the PAC. And what the most success we've had is, first of all, in comparing those costs of PACs from one surgeon to another, because we can see variability there on what may be like PACs. The other way we've done that is to just basically reach out and seek quotes for those items that are in the PAC so that we have a good idea of what the price of those items should be, and we can compare that against our PAC cost. So those are the two ways that we've had a lot of success in renegotiating PACs.
Thank you. Another attendee asks, obviously it is much easier to convert physicians that are investors in the facility. How successful has SCA been with converting non-investor physicians to best practice, and what strategies were utilized to convert those non-investors?
So I don't know the participation of partners versus non-partners in terms of participation. And you're right, incentives aren't necessarily aligned there for non-partner physicians. So, our recommendation would be to leverage your partnering physicians to have that conversation with the non-partner. I think that's, again, they're the owners of the facility. They're the ones that will experience the most financial impact, and probably that's the best way to go about that conversation, but I honestly don't have that data.
Okay, thank you. This next question is, do you ever include the cost of staff time in your case cost analysis?
We have a separate metric where we analyze labor for the facilities, and at the end of the day, it's really, we leave that decision completely up to the facility. So I think there was a study done, and I don't have the actual numbers, a few years ago, where we basically determined that you didn't want to pull more than 2 or 3 additional items outside the PAC. The other thing that I would say is it's not necessarily optimal to standardize PACs across your facility. To your point here about labor, you really want to optimize around what works best in your facility, and make that trade-off around how much additional time are we spending pulling items versus optimizing our PACs.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Well, it looks like we have run out of questions here, so I want to thank Chris for his excellent presentation and for all of you who participated today. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars. This will conclude today's program, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.